So you've been using stock plugins for a while now, and you want to expand your software arsenal with third-party plugins. But which plugins should you get? In this video, I'll give you my recommendations and methods for selecting plugins that work for your situation. Alright, so I've got Ableton 12 Suite here, which comes with an incredible amount of high-quality stock plugins. So, when you want to buy a third-party plugin, you do this for two reasons. The first reason is that your DAW may lack certain plugins. For example, Ableton doesn't have a De-Esser or Autotune plugin. The second reason is that you already have a certain type of plugin, like an EQ or compressor, but you're just looking for a different sound or flavor. Most stock plugins are built to sound transparent, like Ableton's EQ8 or a compressor. But sometimes you just want more color, like an API EQ. Or an 1176 compressor. The first plugin I ever bought was the Waves H compressor. It emulates an analog compressor and has various modes that change the response and the saturation amount. All analog compressors have a specific sound because they add the subtle distortion or color to the sound. And another reason I like this compressor because it has a dry-wet control built in. So you can use that for parallel compression. And it also doesn't introduce much latency. So you can also use it on a return track for New York style compression if you want. This is not always the case with all compressors. Some will cause phase issues when you use them in parallel. For example, I usually use parallel compression on the kick, sometimes the bass as well. And this plugin also has a Transient Enhancer, so you can dial in some more punch if you want to. And a very cool feature is that the release time can be set in musical values, so note values. And this is actually a very useful way to dial in release times, as it's easy to understand for beginners. The only thing you need to keep in mind with this compressor is that it has a built-in makeup gain, and it usually applies a bit too much makeup gain, so you still need to use the output control to match the level. But yeah, a great sounding compressor plugin. Now in terms of EQ, all DAWs have some sort of parametric EQ with a built-in spectrum analyzer. So like EQ8 in Ableton. So as much as I love FabFilter's Pro Q3, this isn't the first plugin I would recommend to a beginner. I'd rather go for an analog EQ model. Boosting frequencies sounds much better on analog models because they use broader curves and sometimes they add a little tiny bit of saturation. So for that analog warmth. So yeah, the second plugin I ever bought was the Waves API 550 EQ. So you get both a 550A and a 550B. And this is perfect for boosting high-end, for example, but also lower frequencies. Also a Pultec style EQ, so a EQ-P1. And this is great for transparently boosting the higher frequencies without getting harsh. So yeah, get an analog model of an EQ. Also this Pultec works great on kick drums but also on the master, especially if you use the low-end trick. So you boost and you attenuate at the same time. Great plugin. Alright, then the third plugin I recommend is Valhalla's vintage verb. This is also one of the plugins I bought from the beginning. Of course, all DAWs feature a stock reverb. And even though I like most of Ableton's stock plugins, the reverb is actually one of their weaker plugins. So this one is part of the upgrades category, but one that will have a huge impact on your mix quality. There's a bunch of great presets in here, and I basically use this thing on everything, so definitely a very versatile plugin. And later on, once you've got an algorithmic reverb and you've got a little bit more experience under your belt, you can venture into mechanical reverbs like plates, springs and chambers. Here, for example, on the drums, I've got an Abbey Road Chambers plugin from Waves. And I often use this to add depth to the sound, because these mechanical reverb emulations impose a specific character to the sound that can't easily be recreated with an algorithmic reverb. It really sounds like it's coming from a room. But a spring reverb is also nice to add some depth. I love this one by Arturia. The whole effect bundle is pretty great actually. Also, a secret I like to use is to use mono reverbs. You don't want to add width to everything, because if you put it on mono, the sound basically moves from wide, up close, to distant and mono, which adds even more depth. But yeah, also plates could work really well, even on bass lines. Superplate, for example, is a great plugin. Right, then one plugin that's not present in all DAWs is a Transient Designer. You can use compression to emphasize transients, but a Transient Designer gives way more flexibility to really add some tick to your kicks. I started out with Transient Master from Native Instruments. So you can increase the attack and the sustain, but you're not tied to a certain threshold. So you can really lengthen or shorten a sound. But lately I've been using Smack Attack from Waves. This one has a lot more control. So you can really affect the length. It also has a built-in limiter or clipper. But if you add a tiny bit in the mix, it will suddenly poke through the mix a lot better. You can add transients with a compressor, but it's never as controlled as this. I believe the original one is invented by SPL, of which Plugin Alliance sells the software version. Alright, then if you're working with vocals, then a De-Esser is a must. Ableton doesn't have one, and I have no idea why. You can use the compressor for it, because the compressor has a built-in EQ.
The mind is time, the mind is space.
So you can focus it on a specific frequency band.
The mind is time, the mind is space.
So it responds more to that frequency.
The mind is time, the mind is space.
But I could never get this to work as accurately. And yeah, all other DAWs that I know of do have a De-Esser plugin. So for this one I would probably recommend a Waves De-Esser as well. It's only $30 or so. It's really simple to use. Just turn down the threshold and you can change the frequency. And by default, it's set to split mode. So that means it works like a crossover filter. So it won't compress the lower frequencies, only the S's.
The mind is time, the mind is time, the mind is space. A horn rush, a bass flush for minds to taste. The mind is time, the mind is space. A horn rush, a bass.
Really simple to use, but you can't mix without this.
The mind is time, the mind is time, the mind is space. The mind is time, the mind is space. A horn rush, a bass flush for minds.
And by the way, you can also use De-Essers on loud cymbal sounds. So on acoustic drums, but maybe also really sharp electronic drums. So you can tame the higher frequencies as well. Another vocal plugin that's missing in Ableton, and one of the main reasons I use Cubase for editing and mix work mainly, and that's a vocal correction plugin. Cubase has Very Audio, which is the most easy to use and transparent vocal tuning software I've ever used.
On the run, 'cause all I need is us. Run, 'cause all I need is us.
Logic also has flex pitch, which is great, but in other DAWs, you need an external editor. And the industry standard for this is Melodyne. So if you're working with vocalists or wind instruments, sometimes even synths or bass, then you definitely need Melodyne. I never actually recommend Autotune or something similar. Although it's super quick, it's never as transparent. You don't want to edit all the life out of your vocals.
Angels are dancing on the clouds.
Only edit those notes that really need it. And that's what a tool like Melodyne can do best. Right, so instead of buying single plugins, most manufacturers also provide plugin bundles. And this can save a lot of money, especially if you can get your hands on an educational discount. And the Arturia bundles and the Soundtoys bundle are like no other. But it might be a bit too overwhelming to start out with. So I wouldn't recommend that from the start. Just start with 1 or 2 plugins. But in terms of money, the best bang for your buck is probably a subscription model. So like the ones from Waves, Slate, Plugin Alliance, or Universal Audio also offers a subscription model. Some are more expensive than others, but with UAD for example, I think one plugin of them costs like $200 or something. I think you can get a subscription for a year for the price of one regular plugin. So that's something you may want to have a look at. By the way, I've got some affiliate links in the description, which helps me run this channel. So if you intend to buy anything, that would mean a lot to me. But even with subscriptions, try to focus on one plugin at a time. Download one EQ and use it on everything to get a feel for its sweet spots and its weaknesses. Truly understanding a handful of plugins is way more important than picking a random plugin without ever diving deep. Limitation is key here. So, start with one compressor and one EQ for example, or one reverb. And then after a couple months, buy your next plugin. Alright, I hope I gave you a good overview of some of the plugins I would start with. Of course, it's different for everyone. So make sure to download a demo version before you drop your hard-earned cash. Also let me know which plugins you decided to get in the comments. Or if you have any other recommendations. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll see you next week with another tutorial.